And now we are reaching we have reached the final paper by Ugur, Ümit, and at the Institute for War, Holocaust and Gender Studies in Amsterdam. His main area of interest is the historical sociology of mass political violence. His books include Confiscation and Disruption, The Young Turk Seizure of Armenian Property, and The Making of Modern Turkey, Nation and State in Eastern Anatolia, 1913-1950. In 2013, the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences awarded him the Young Scientist Award for History, which I believe is a nice thing. This having been said, today he will be talking about explaining regional variation in the Armenian genocide, and I apologize to Dr. Üngör. Just a second. There is here something. If you have access to the live streaming of this conference, please add your name on this and you'll get an email. Sorry, Dr. Üngör, please.
Thank you very much, Stefan, for your introduction. Thank you also very much for inviting me to. Also, thank you all very much for still being here. I know it's a very long day, and we are all tired. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to keep my talk relatively short. I'll focus on 2 or 3 central problems because I'm the last speaker. We have moved from the mid to late 19th century to the early 20th century, through the Balkan Wars in 1912-15. So I'll focus on 1915 in particular. My central intellectual pursuits are how does mass violence emerge, how does it develop, and what are its consequences. And the Armenian case is one of the cases I'm interested in, that I've done research on, and currently working on other cases. What I'd like to do here is, does the microphone work? Let's switch it on. No, this is okay, good. I have to be a bit closer to the microphone. Yeah. Okay. Very good. Thank you. What I'll do today is I'll central problems that I think have not yet been resolved in the Armenian genocide research field, and I'll try to come up with some answers, but there are also a lot of questions still laying on the table, and I'm also later in the question and answer in the discussion. And to do that, I'd like to begin by challenging this idea that genocide is a kind of monolithic entity. So there's a state in a capital. It has perfect control over every single cell and village of society. It launches its apparatus of violence, militias, or its police, or gendarmerie, or army, and it carries out perfectly executed genocide, synchronous in every single region. So this idea that the genocides are homogeneous has been challenged a lot in recent research on genocide. And what we can do, I think, what we can learn in Armenian genocide research from other cases is how we can challenging homogeneity. And to do that, I'd like to use this rather bizarre quote from, you might know, who's written a book, The Armenian Massacres, a Contested Genocide. And he makes the following point. I quote, "Allegations of a systematic and deliberate elimination of the Armenian population further undercut by the exemption of the large Armenians of Istanbul, Izmir, and Aleppo from deportation. These exemptions are analogous to Hitler exempting the Jews of Berlin, Frankfurt, and Cologne from the final." End of quote. Now, just as a as a joke, if we calculate that through, actually through its logic, what we see is that obviously the 210,000 Jews that would then be excluded from the Holocaust certainly do not in any way weigh up to the other 5.8 million victims, of course. So in a way, this is a self-defeating argument. In trying to undermine and deny the genocide, has made an important point here, actually. Because by dragging out differences, and I use the term dragging out literally, dragging out differences in the genocide. Differences in time, differences in space, differences in intensity. He actually helps us conceptualize the Armenian genocide slightly better. Because the central problem of my talk will be, how can we explain the course and the variation within the genocide? And to do that, I'd like to show you a map. Now, this map was published by Aran Saray. It's a map of spatial differences in the genocide. Maybe I should say briefly what this is based on. This is based on Talat Pasha's own documentation. He has this little black in which he kept note of the kind of the demographic of the deportations. So there's this booklet that he kept, which was later given by his widow to a Turkish journalist named Murat Bardakçı. And Bardakçı published this. We thank him very much for that. It was translated to English. And what you see here, so you can take the graphs and put them in into maps. You see the following landscape. You see basically three groups of Armenians during the genocide in these pie charts. The group that's black are Armenians that were killed in the province, no deportations, or deportation and immediate destruction in the provinces in 1915. The dark gray percentage of Armenians who were deported in 1915, but who were still alive in 1917 in a different province, whether that was Halep or Urfa or Adana. And the light gray is the percentage of Armenians who were not deported in 1917, up to 1917. Now, if I would ask you, what do you see in these maps? I think it's pretty clear that we see a pretty interesting variation. First of all, you see, of course, that, there's an east-west problem here. In the eastern provinces, the destruction is nearly complete. So, provinces like Diyarbakır, for example, gets 97%, Bitlis 99%, and Van even a staggering 100%. These are, of course, Armenians who did not flee to Iran or to the Russian Empire, but who were under Ottoman jurisdiction, roughly. But then on the other hand, we have in the central and western Anatolia, such as Kayseri, Adana, pretty important provinces with Armenian presence, we see a different panorama, namely that Adana is an interesting case. 38% Armenians killed in 1915, 38% deported from Adana but still alive elsewhere, like in Halep or maybe Derzor. And 24% of Armenians in 1917 in Adana were not deported. Now, the question that we have to ask here is which combination of factors accounts for variation? And I'll try to explain this a little bit more. I've seen quite a few regional studies in the Armenian genocide. I've written one myself of Diyarbakır. Hilmar Kaiser has written the book on Diyarbakır as well. There are other cases. The very thick book by Raymond Kevorkian, The Armenian Genocide, a complete history, provincially organized. Now, I think these are extremely important studies, and we should definitely look at them and read them. But some of them have some shortcomings in that they are empirical, so they give facts, but they're not systematic in the comparison of these provinces. Like Kevorkian, for example, does not necessarily compare why these provinces don't have different outcomes. The second thing is that these books are not often very conceptual. One phenomenon in the genocide, like militia formation, or you name it, or help, it's not necessarily comparatively treated in a systematic way. Now, what we see here, so I talked about East and West difference. You can see provincial difference. Some provinces really significantly different from the other. And we also have district differences. So if you break this down even further into the districts, then you probably see more differences there as well. We don't have that map yet, but I'm sure that some of my colleagues are working on it. Now, if we look at other cases of mass violence, because all genocides are regionally varied, all of them. Those genocides that span a huge territory, like the Holocaust, which is a whole continent basically, from the North Sea all the way down to the Ural, or even the genocide in Rwanda. Rwanda is a tiny country, but even in Rwanda you saw that there were significant differences in how the genocide developed in the east, for example, close to the lake, or in the south. In the south, it came much later, it was much less intense. In the west, by the lake, it was immediate destruction in the first few weeks, actually, of the genocide. Why? Now, some of my colleagues, such as Ernesto Verdeja or Omar Mikdoum, recently also Henry Sukiev, have argued that it's possible to think of some factors or variables, as social scientists would call it, that explain this. One is, for example, geography, the physical, but also the political geography, the human geography. So Trabzon, for example, while on the east, obviously, you have the Russian front, relatively low. Then we have, of course, victim behavior, the issue of resistance. Regions armies maybe resisted more. In others, politics mattered. We know, for example, we heard about Tashnak Tsutyun. At some point, it's very likely that the Young Turks, or that this kind of radical wing within this regime, probably at some point decided to murder the entire membership of this political party. Now, in some regions where the ARF was stronger, probably there was more violence than other. But we don't know unless we do, of course, the detailed studies that require this. The third and probably most decisive factor is perpetrator behavior. So we have to look within the regime, from the top of the regime all the way down to the provinces, how ideology, for example, mattered. Corruption seems to have been a very important factor. Social segregation versus social integration. So there are these sociological concepts that you could use and apply in looking at or explaining these differences. I would also argue that the takeover of the state bureaucracy by the regime or by the CUP is important. And I'll try to give some examples there. Now, in the scholarship, I think you can see four important polarities. In other words, spectrums along which you can assess this difference. The first one, I think, is dispositional versus situational factors. So, to what extent is the disposition of the person, personal characteristic, versus the fact that we were in a civil war, in a world war, and orders were given, and the perpetrators found themselves in a situation. That's one important polarity. The second important one is center versus periphery. To what extent was the genocide centrally organized and centrally managed also throughout the months and years, versus to what extent was the genocide a peripheral thing? So to what extent did the regime in Istanbul leave it up to the provinces to deal with the matter, basically? The third important problem is, of course, ideology. Ideology versus pragmatism. Was this a Turkish nationalist, irrational ideological project in which the regime had a number of Armenians below 5%? Pragmatism, as in, well, we just kind of put the punch, play it by ear, see how it develops on the ground. And finally, of course, long-term planning versus short-term reactions. I mean, this last one is such a difficult. I think we'll leave that for discussion tomorrow. So what I'd like to do is now to exemplify these 3 points, the first three. Versus situation, center versus periphery, and ideology versus pragmatism. And the first problem, and some of these gentlemen already mentioned, are the governance. So if you go back to this map just for a second, obviously each of these provinces during the genocide. Sometimes in 2 cases of the governors, they stayed on throughout the entire war. Now, if we look at some of them, I'd like to examine them. So from left to right, I'll start first with Mehmet Celal Bey, who was the governor in Konya, the moment that, in the months that the genocide began, when deportations were being ordered. Now, this man is famous for rejecting the deportation orders, and also writing about it during and after the war. He got these orders from Talat, from Istanbul, and he rejected it. He said, this is not a good idea. This is against the honor of the Ottoman state. Metaphors such as that, but also he simply didn't have the means to organize them. He didn't seem to be terribly happy with organizing the deportation. So later he was sacked, and he kind of set out the war. And at the end of the war, wrote a very interesting and rather touching memoir about how he went through this process and how Talat kept on bullying him, badgering him to continue. which he never did. He even tried to help quite a bit. Now, as a result, Konya is not on this map that I showed, but in Konya you see that survival rates are slightly higher, and I wonder whether this has anything to do with it. And the second from the left, we have Rahmi Bey in Izmir. Now, Izmir is an interesting case. We have a few pretty good studies on it. But this is also a man not terribly enthusiastic for the deportation of the Armenians. There's very little, no evidence of any hatred against Christians or Armenians, and he kind of flat out rejected to cooperate during the genocide. These two men, and there are a few others, one or two maybe others, district governors also, are the exceptions, I think. There are also quite a few, and those are the gentlemen slightly higher here. Number 3 from the left, Mustafa Abdulhalik Renda. Renda is his last name he took after 1934 surname law, I think. Now he was governor in Bitlis. Very interesting that Yektan mentioned that he actually distributed weapons to Armenians to kind of be a counterweight against the Kurdish uprising in Bitlis. But we saw the statistics in Bitlis. We have very good eyewitness accounts from all different actors and individuals in Bitlis, and he was very, very thorough in the destruction of the Armenians during the genocide. Thorough to the point of fanatical about it in his job of this, because obviously it's just a job for him. Now, what do we know about this particular case? There seems to be relatively little evidence of anti-Armenian hatred in this Abdulhalik Renda. He seems to be a rather impersonal bureaucrat, just carrying out orders, really. And most importantly, he might have been a man who was sincerely motivated by careerism. So one way to move forward is simply to work along with what the regime wants, and then I'm governor now, maybe I can become a minister next year or the year after. So this might be one explanation. Then on the right, we have Cemal Azmi Bey, who was mentioned by Professor Zürcher. He was the governor of Trabzon, also a very thorough executioner of the Armenians. The American consul, as well as the German officers and eyewitnesses, Ottoman Turks as well as Armenians, are very clear on his cooperation, his collaboration in the genocide. Very thorough, rounded up people in villages, executed them on the spot. Some of them, others were deported closer to Bayreuth, and then many were also put on boats and then drowned on the Black Sea. There's some evidence of that as well. Numerically not as high as the actual killings in the village, the massacres, but still relevant. Now, so we see that if we want to explain these differences, we have to look at these governments. And we have to explain, I think, the point here I'm trying to make, is were these men motivated by their disposition, so by their personalities, or by their kind of personal biographies, or does situationism explain their actions a bit better? Because if there's no evidence for hatred, for ethnic hatred, if that doesn't explain the zealousness, I'll give one more example in a minute. So that's the first point, person versus situation. The second is center versus periphery. And here I'd like to come up with my famous example of Diyarbakir. This is the province that I studied the most. I think it's instructive for several reasons. So here's a map, you get a sense of where this province is. In the early spring of 1915, the government in Istanbul appointed Dr. Mehmed Rashid to this province. Now he was relatively radical. There's quite some evidence that even in 1914, even before, was pretty anti-Armenian, Of course, he was a Circassian. His family was expelled. That might explain some of it, but maybe not all of it. That's deterministic, as if our families determine everything in our attitudes. And it's important here to note that this man, he worked ahead of the instructions in rounding up and massively executing the Armenians in Diyarbakir. So, wait for orders, he was actually ahead of the norm of the genocide. All genocides have a norm they develop, and he was ahead of the norm. He was even called back by Talat, as in, you're going too fast, you're killing too many people. You're killing also categories you're not supposed to kill, like the Assyrians, for example. So that says the thing about center and periphery. Radicalization doesn't necessarily come from above, top down. It can also be a bottom up and peripheral regional process. My third point was about ideology versus pragmatism. And here I want to develop further in this example in Diyarbakir. Ryan Üngör has talked about notable families, how important it was to incorporate in bureaucracy. Here we see that in Diyarbakir there were at least three important families. There were many others, but these were the quite prominent ones. These three families were kind of run, or they were led by these notables. Aziz Feyzi on the left, very important man, who worked together very closely with Dr. Rashid in destroying the city of Diyarbakir and the immediate countryside. For those of you who have been there, Diyarbakir is on the Tigris River. There's a very wide kind of just where there's viticulture, there's wine and grapes, and watermelons are quite famous there as well, rice fields. So the government, local, so Dr. Rashid, he managed to exploit the competition for resources that existed between these families. So this was very much about state power and kind of economic competition. And the three families here, so it sounds a little bit like the New York Mafia, the 5 families and 5 boroughs of this kind. Not entirely dissimilar. The Pirinçizade family came out on top, not necessarily because they hated the Armenians so much, but because of their ability to cater to the needs of the regime. And the needs of the regime were militias. So we mentioned that those who killing had to be done. So you need to generate perpetrators. Which of these families can come up with them best? It was the Pirinçizade. They did a pretty good job in that. Here's a picture of the militias. I call this militia as a business family model. As a family business model, sorry. And we see that the recruitment of all kinds of men, so cousins and nephews, but also imams, rather vague and dubious individuals, solidified the kin ties. It made the family stronger. The family came out of the war stronger than before. And also important, I should mention this as well, the genocide empowered a younger generation of men in this family against the old establishment of these old guys who thought they were running the family. Not anymore, obviously, because here we see a picture from the family photo album, a very significant moment in their family history in which they took over large parts of the city and the economy of the city. The grandchildren, by the way, I'll show it. They're still alive. I'll give you one more note. The grandchildren of the Pirinç alive. They are not very happy with the research that's being done on their grandparents. But the grandchildren of Dr. Rashid, interestingly, Müge Göçek told me that the grandchildren, they're actually ashamed of the grandparents. But that's quite interesting to me. I think we should also talk to these people. Now, finally, my conclusions. I think regional differences, they depended on the Armenian reform plan. We see that those provinces where the reform plan was supposed to be executed saw complete destruction in situ of Armenians. Proximity to the front, this needs to be disentangled a bit more because we don't know whether it's a war that caused the radicalism or the reform plan. My second point would be the takeover of the state bureaucracy in the provinces. Very important. Behavior of local elites, talked a bit about that, ideology, corruption, resistance, mobilization, and the distribution of Armenian property. Now I'd like to end with a little optimistic note today. And this Celal Bey that I mentioned, the governor of Konya, so let me briefly show this picture again. So the man all the way on the left, who actually also did his best. Oh, sorry, this is obviously. Let me just show briefly. Here we go again, all the way on the left. Quite an important man, rather benevolent, I think, to the Armenians. When you Google him, you end up on this website. I hope I can show this. In a second.
Yeah, down.
Help me out here.
I have no idea.
I'm sure the website. Okay.
Okay, then do we need to move it somewhere?
Like this. Okay, here we go. So here you see it's called mehmetcelalbey.com. And this is actually the website of his great-great-grandson. And he made this website. Kind of honors this. And it's kind of cute because you see here. That's the kid. And he's kind of made a website like an online monument or something to his great grandfathers. So I just want to end with that.